Introduction and Chapter 1 of Trauma and Recovery: The Aftermath of Violence from Domestic Abuse to Political Terror by Judith Herman, M.D. Opening quotation from Salman Rushdie, Shame, 1983. I had thought, before I began, that what I had on my hands was an almost excessively masculine tale, a saga of sexual rivalry, ambition, power, patronage, betrayal, death, revenge. But the women seemed to have taken over. They marched in from the peripheries of the story to demand the inclusion of their own tragedies, histories, and comedies, obliging me to couch my narrative in all manner of sinuous complexities, to see my male plot refracted, so to speak, through the prisms of its reverse and female side. It occurs to me that the women who knew precisely what they were up to, their stories explain and even subsume the men's. Repression is a seamless garment, a society which is authoritarian in its social and sexual codes, which crushes its women beneath the intolerable burdens of honor and propriety, breeds repression of other kinds as well. Contrariwise, dictators are always, or at least in public, on other people's behalf, puritanical. So it turns out that my male and female plots are the same story after all. Introduction. The ordinary response to atrocities is to banish them from consciousness. Certain violations of the social compact are too terrible to utter aloud. This is the meaning of the word unspeakable. Atrocities, however, refuse to be buried. Equally as powerful as the desire to deny atrocities is the conviction that denial does not work. Folk wisdom is filled with ghosts who refuse to rest in their graves until their stories are told. Murder will out. Remembering and telling the truth about terrible events are prerequisites both for the restoration of the social order and for the healing of individual victims. The conflict between the will to deny horrible events and the will to proclaim them aloud is the central dialectic of psychological trauma. People who have survived atrocities often tell their stories in a highly emotional, contradictory, and fragmented manner, which undermines their credibility and thereby serves the twin imperatives of truth-telling and secrecy. When the truth is finally recognized, survivors can begin their recovery. But far too often, secrecy prevails, and the story of the traumatic event services not as a verbal narrative, but as a symptom. The psychological distress symptoms of traumatized people simultaneously call attention to the existence of an unspeakable secret and deflect attention from it. This is most apparent in the way traumatized people alternate between feeling numb and reliving the event. The dialectic of trauma gives rise to complicated, sometimes uncanny alterations of consciousness, which George Orwell, one of the committed truth-tellers of our century, called doublethink, and which mental health professionals, searching for a calm, precise language, call dissociation. It results in the protean, dramatic, and often bizarre symptoms of hysteria, which Freud recognized a century ago as disguised communication about sexual abuse in childhood. Witnesses as well as victims are subject to the dialectic of trauma. It is difficult for an observer to remain clear-headed and calm, to see more than a few fragments of the picture at one time, to retain all the pieces and to fit them together. It is even more difficult to find a language that conveys fully and persuasively what one has seen. Those who attempt to describe the atrocities that they have witnessed also risk their own credibility. To speak publicly about one's knowledge of atrocities is to invite the stigma that attaches to victims. The knowledge of horrible events periodically intrudes into public awareness, but is rarely retained for long. Denial, repression, and dissociation operate on a social as well as an individual level. The study of psychological trauma has an Underground history. Like traumatized people, we have been cut off from the knowledge of our past. Like traumatized people, we need to understand the past in order to reclaim the present and the future. Therefore, an understanding of psychological trauma begins with rediscovering history. Clinicians know the privileged moment of insight when repressed ideas, feelings, and memories surface into consciousness. These moments occur in the history of societies as well as in the history of individuals. In the 1970s, the speakouts of the women's liberation movement brought to public awareness the widespread crimes of violence against women. Victims who had been silenced began to reveal their secrets. As a psychiatric resident, I heard numerous stories of sexual and domestic violence from my patients. Because of my involvement in the women's movement, I was able to speak out against the denial of women's real experiences in my own profession and testify to what I had witnessed. My first paper on incest, written with Lisa Hershman in 1976, circulated underground in manuscript for a year before it was published. We began to receive letters from all over the country from women who had never before told their stories. Through them, we realized the power of speaking the unspeakable and witnessed firsthand the creative energy that is released when the barriers of denial and repression are lifted. Trauma and recovery represents the fruits of 2 decades of research and clinical work with victims of sexual and domestic violence. It also reflects a growing body of experience with many other traumatized people, particularly combat veterans and the victims of political terror. This is a book about restoring connections between the public and private worlds, between the individual and community, between men and women. It is a book about commonalities, between rape survivors and combat veterans, between battered women and political prisoners, between the survivors of vast concentration camps created by tyrants who rule nations, and the survivors of small, hidden concentration camps created by tyrants who rule their homes. People who have endured horrible events suffer predictable psychological harm. There is a spectrum of traumatic disorders, ranging from the effects of a single overwhelming event to the more complicated effects of prolonged and repeated abuse. Established diagnostic concepts, especially the severe personality disorders commonly diagnosed in women, have generally failed to recognize the impact of victimization. The first part of this book delineates the spectrum of human adaptation to traumatic events and gives a new diagnostic name to the psychological disorder found in survivors of prolonged, repeated abuse. Because the traumatic syndromes have basic features in common, the recovery process also follows a common pathway. The fundamental stages of recovery are establishing safety, reconstructing the trauma story, and restoring the connection between survivors and their community. The second part of the book develops an overview of the healing process and offers a new conceptual framework for psychotherapy with traumatized people. Both the characteristics of the traumatic disorders and the principles of treatment are illustrated with the testimony of survivors and with case examples drawn from a diverse literature. The research sources for this book include my own earlier studies of incest survivors and my more recent study of the role of childhood trauma in the condition known as borderline personality disorder. The clinical sources of this book are my 20 years of practice at a feminist mental health clinic and 10 years as a teacher and supervisor in a university teaching hospital. The testimony of trauma survivors is at the heart of the book. To preserve confidentiality, I have identified all of my informants by pseudonyms, with 2 exceptions. First, I have identified therapists and clinicians who were interviewed about their work, and second, I have identified survivors who have already made themselves known publicly. The case vignettes that appear here are fictitious, Each one is a composite based on the experiences of many different patients, not of an individual. Survivors challenge us to reconnect fragments, to reconstruct history, to make meaning of their present symptoms in the light of past events. I have attempted to integrate clinical and social perspectives on trauma without sacrificing either the complexity of individual experience or the breadth of political context. I have tried to unify an apparently divergent body of knowledge and to develop concepts that apply equally to the experience of domestic and sexual life, the traditional sphere of women, and to the experiences of war and political life, the traditional sphere of men. This book appears at a time when public discussion of the common atrocities of sexual and domestic life has been made possible by the women's movement, and when public discussion of the common atrocities of political life has been made possible by the movement for human rights. I expect the book to be controversial. First, because it is written from a feminist perspective. Second, because it challenges established diagnostic concepts. But third, and perhaps most importantly, because it speaks about horrible things, things that no one really wants to hear about. I have tried to communicate my ideas in a language that preserves connections, a language that is faithful both to the dispassionate, reasoned traditions of my profession and to the passionate claims of people who have been violated and outraged. I have tried to find a language that can withstand the imperatives of doublethink and allows all of us to come a little closer to facing the unspeakable. Chapter 1 of Forgotten History. The study of psychological trauma has a curious history, one of episodic amnesia. Periods of active investigation have alternated with periods of oblivion. Repeatedly, in the past century, similar lines of inquiry have been taken up and abruptly abandoned, only to be rediscovered much later. Classic documents of 50 or 100 years ago often read like contemporary works. Though the field has, in fact, an abundant and rich tradition, it has been periodically forgotten and must be periodically reclaimed. This intermittent amnesia is not the result of the ordinary changes in fashion that affect any intellectual pursuit. The study of psychological trauma does not languish for lack of interest. Rather, the subject provokes such intense controversy that it periodically becomes anathema. The study of psychological trauma has repeatedly led into realms of the unthinkable and foundered on fundamental questions of belief. To study psychological trauma is to come face to face both with human vulnerability in the natural world and with the capacity for evil in human nature. To study psychological trauma means bearing witness to horrible events. When the events are natural disasters or acts of God, those who bear witness sympathize readily with the victim. But when the traumatic events are of human design, those who bear witness are caught in the conflict between victim and perpetrator. It is morally impossible to remain neutral in this conflict. The bystander is forced to take sides. It is very tempting to take the side of the perpetrator. All the perpetrator asks is that the bystander do nothing. He appeals to the universal desire to see, hear, and speak no evil. The victim, on the contrary, asks the bystander to share the burden of pain. The victim demands action, engagement, and remembering. Leo Eitinger, a psychiatrist who has studied survivors of the Nazi concentration camps, describes the cruel conflict of interest between victim and bystander. Quote, "War and victims are something the community wants to forget. A veil of oblivion is drawn over everything painful and unpleasant. We find the two sides face to face. On one side, the victims who perhaps wish to forget but cannot, and on the other, all those with strong, often unconscious motives who very intensely both wish to forget and succeed in doing so. The contrast is frequently very painful for both sides. The weakest one, remains the losing party in this silent and unequal dialogue." End quote. In order to escape accountability for his crimes, the perpetrator does everything in his power to promote forgetting. Secrecy and silence are the perpetrator's first line of defense. If secrecy fails, the perpetrator attacks the credibility of his victim. If he cannot silence her absolutely, he tries to make sure that no one listens. To this end, he marshals an impressive array of arguments, from the most blatant denial to the most sophisticated and elegant rationalization. After every atrocity, one can expect to hear the same predictable apologies. It never happened, the victim lies, the victim exaggerates, the victim brought it upon herself, and, in any case, it is time to forget the past and move on. The more powerful the perpetrator, the greater is his prerogative to name and define reality, and the more completely his arguments prevail. The perpetrator's arguments prove irresistible when the bystander faces them in isolation. Without a supportive social environment, the bystander usually succumbs to the temptation to look the other way. This is true even when the victim is an idealized and valued member of society. Soldiers in every war, even those who have been regarded as heroes, complain bitterly that no one wants to know the real truth about war. When the victim is already devalued, a woman, a child, she may find that the most traumatic events of her life take place outside the realm of socially validated reality. Her experience becomes unspeakable. The study of psychological trauma must constantly contend with this tendency to discredit the victim or to render her invisible. Throughout the history of the field, dispute has raged over whether patients with post-traumatic conditions are entitled to care and respect, or deserving of contempt, whether they are genuinely suffering or malingering, whether their histories are true or false, and if false, whether imagined or maliciously fabricated. In spite of a vast literature documenting the phenomenon of psychological trauma, debate still centers on the basic question of whether these phenomena are credible and real. It is not only the patients but also the investigators of post-traumatic conditions whose credibility is repeatedly challenged. Clinicians who listen too long and too carefully to traumatized patients often become suspect among their colleagues, as though contaminated by contact. Investigators who pursue the field too far beyond the bounds of conventional belief are often subjected to a kind of professional isolation. To hold traumatic reality in consciousness requires a social context that affirms and protects the victim and that joins victim and witness in a common alliance. For the individual victim, this social context is created by relationships with friends, lovers, and family. For the larger society, the social context is created by political movements that give voice to the disempowered. The systematic study of psychological trauma, therefore, depends on the support of a political movement. Indeed, whether such study can be pursued or discussed in public is itself a political question. The study of war trauma becomes legitimate only in a context that challenges the sacrifice of young men in war. The study of trauma in sexual and domestic life becomes legitimate only in a context that challenges the subordination of women and children. Advances in the field occur only when they are supported by a political movement powerful enough to legitimate an alliance between investigators and patients, and to counteract the ordinary social processes of silencing and denial. In the absence of strong political movements for human rights, the active process of bearing witness inevitably gives way to the active process of forgetting. Repression, dissociation, and denial are phenomena of social as well as individual consciousness. 3 times over the past century, A particular form of psychological trauma has surfaced into public consciousness. Each time, the investigation of that trauma has flourished in affiliation with a political movement. The first to emerge was hysteria, the archetypal psychological disorder of women. Its study grew out of the Republican, anti-clerical political movement of the late 19th century in France. The second was shell shock, or combat neurosis. Its study began in England and the United States after the First World War and reached a peak after the Vietnam War. Its political context was the collapse of a cult of war and the growth of an anti-war movement. The last and most recent trauma to come into public awareness is sexual and domestic violence. Its political context is the feminist movement of Western Europe and North America. Our contemporary understanding of psychological trauma is built upon a synthesis of these three separate lines of investigation. Section: The Heroic Age of Hysteria. For 2 decades in the late 19th century, the disorder called hysteria became a major focus of serious inquiry. The term hysteria was so commonly understood at the time that no one actually had taken the trouble to define it systematically. In the words of one historian, quote, "For 25 centuries, hysteria had been considered a strange disease with incoherent and incomprehensible symptoms. Most physicians believed it to be a disease proper to women and originating in the uterus." End quote. Hence the name hysteria. As another historian explained, hysteria was, quote, "a dramatic medical metaphor for everything that men found mysterious or unmanageable in the opposite sex." End quote. The patriarch of the study of hysteria was the great French neurologist Jean-Martin Charcot. His kingdom was the Salpêtrière, an ancient, expansive hospital complex which had long been an asylum for the most wretched of the Parisian proletariat, beggars, prostitutes, and the insane. Charcot transformed this neglected facility into a temple of modern science, and the most gifted and ambitious men in the new disciplines of neurology and psychiatry journeyed to Paris to study with the master. Among the many distinguished physicians who made the pilgrimage to the Salpêtrière were Pierre Janet, William James, and Sigmund Freud. The study of hysteria captured the public imagination as a great venture into the unknown. Charcot's investigations were renowned not only in the world of medicine, but also in the larger worlds of literature and politics. His Tuesday lectures were theatrical events, attended by, quote, "a multi-colored audience drawn from all of Paris, authors, doctors, leading actors and actresses, fashionable demi-mondaines, all full of morbid curiosity." End quote. In these lectures, Charcot illustrated his findings on hysteria by live demonstrations. The patients he put on display were young women who had found refuge in the Salpêtrière from lives of unremitting violence, exploitation, and rape. The asylum provided them greater safety and protection than they had ever known. For a selected group of women, who became Charcot's star performers, the asylum also offered something close to fame. Charcot was credited for great courage in venturing to study hysteria at all. His prestige gave credibility to a field that had been considered beyond the pale of serious scientific investigation. Prior to Charcot's time, hysterical women had been thought of as malingerers, and their treatment had been relegated to the domain of hypnotists and popular healers. On Charcot's death, Freud eulogized him as a liberating patron of the afflicted. Quote, "No credence was given to a hysteric about anything. The first thing that Charcot's work did was to restore its dignity to the topic. Little by little, people gave up the scornful smile with which the patient could at that time feel certain of being met. She was no longer necessarily a malingerer, for Charcot had thrown the whole weight of his authority on the side of the genuineness and objectivity of hysterical phenomena." Charcot's approach to hysteria, which he called the great neurosis, was that of the taxonomist. He emphasized careful observation, description, and classification. He documented the characteristic symptoms of hysteria exhaustively, not only in writing but also with drawings and photographs. Charcot focused on the symptoms of hysteria that resembled neurological damage, motor paralyses, sensory losses, convulsions, and amnesias. By 1880, he had demonstrated that these symptoms were psychological, since they could be artificially induced and relieved through the use of hypnosis. Though Charcot paid minute attention to the symptoms of his hysterical patients, he had no interest whatsoever in their inner lives. He viewed their emotions as symptoms to be catalogued. He described their speech as vocalization. His stance regarding his patients is apparent in a verbatim account of one of his Tuesday lectures, where a young woman in hypnotic trance was being used to demonstrate a convulsive hysterical attack. Charcot: "Let us press again on the hysterogenic point." A male intern touches the patient in the ovarian region. "Here we go again. Occasionally subjects even bite their tongues, but this would be rare. Look at the arched back, which is so well described in textbooks." Patient: "Mother, I am frightened." Charcot: "Note the emotional outburst. If we let things go unabated, we will soon return to the epileptoid behavior." The patient cries out again, "Oh, mother!" Charcot: "Again note these screams. You could say it is a lot of noise over nothing." The ambition of Charcot's followers was to surpass his work by demonstrating the cause of hysteria. Rivalry was particularly intense between Genet and Freud. Each wanted to be the first to make the great discovery. In pursuit of their goal, these investigators found that it was not sufficient to observe and classify hysterics. It was necessary to talk with them. For a brief decade, men of science listened to women with a devotion and a respect unparalleled before or since. Daily meetings with hysterical patients, often lasting for hours, were not uncommon. The case studies of this period read almost like collaborations between doctor and patient. These investigations bore fruit. By the mid-1890s, Genet in France and Freud, with his collaborator Joseph Breuer in Vienna, had arrived independently at strikingly similar formulations. Hysteria was a condition caused by psychological trauma. Unbearable emotional reactions to traumatic events produced an altered state of consciousness, which in turn induced the hysterical symptoms. Genet called this alteration in consciousness dissociation. Breuer and Freud called it double consciousness. Both Genet and Freud recognized the essential similarity of altered states of consciousness induced by psychological trauma and those induced by hypnosis. Genet believed that the capacity for dissociation, or hypnotic trance, was a sign of psychological weakness and suggestibility. Breuer and Freud argued, on the contrary, that hysteria, with its associated alterations of consciousness, could be found among, quote, "people of the clearest intellect, strongest will, greatest character, and highest critical power," end quote. Both Genet and Freud recognized that the somatic symptoms of hysteria represented disguised representations of intensely distressing events which had been banished from memory. Genet described his hysterical patients as governed by subconscious fixed ideas, the memories of traumatic events. Breuer and Freud, in an immortal summation, wrote that hysterics suffer mainly from reminiscences. By the mid-1890s, these investigators had also discovered that hysterical symptoms could be alleviated when the traumatic memories, as well as the intense feelings that accompanied them, were recovered and put into words. This method of treatment became the basis of modern psychotherapy. Genet called the technique psychological analysis. Breuer and Freud called it abreaction or catharsis, and Freud later called it psychoanalysis. But the simplest and perhaps best name was invented by one of Breuer's patients, a gifted, intelligent, and severely disturbed young woman to whom he gave the pseudonym Anna O. She called her intimate dialogue with Breuer the talking cure. The collaborations between doctor and patient took on the quality of a quest, in which the solution to the mystery of hysteria could be found in the painstaking reconstruction of the patient's past. Genet, describing his work with one patient, noted that as treatment proceeded, the uncovering of recent traumas gave way to the exploration of earlier events. Quote, "By removing the superficial layer of the delusions, I favored the appearance of old and tenacious fixed ideas, which dwelt still at the bottom of her mind. The latter disappeared in turn, thus bringing forth a great improvement." End quote. Breuer, describing his work with Anna O., spoke of following back the thread of memory. It was Freud who followed the thread the furthest, and invariably this led him into an exploration of the sexual lives of women. In spite of an ancient clinical tradition that recognized the association of hysterical symptoms with female sexuality, Freud's mentors, Charcot and Breuer, had been highly skeptical about the role of sexuality in the origins of hysteria. Freud himself was initially resistant to the idea. Quote, "When I began to analyze the second patient, the expectation of a sexual neurosis being the basis of hysteria was fairly remote from my mind. I had come fresh from the school of Charcot, and I regarded the linking of hysteria with the topic of sexuality as a sort of insult, just as the women patients themselves do." End quote. This emphatic identification with his patients' reactions is characteristic of Freud's early writings on hysteria. His case histories reveal a man possessed of such passionate curiosity that he was willing to overcome his own defensiveness, and willing to listen. What he heard was appalling. Repeatedly, his patients told him of sexual assault, abuse, and incest. Following back the thread of memory, Freud and his patients uncovered major traumatic events of childhood concealed beneath the more recent, often relatively trivial experiences that had actually triggered the onset of hysterical symptoms. By 1896, Freud believed he had found the source. In a report on 18 case studies, entitled The Etiology of Hysteria, he made a dramatic claim. Quote, "I therefore put forward the thesis that at the bottom of every case of hysteria there are one or more occurrences of premature sexual experience, occurrences which belong to the earliest years of childhood, but which can be reproduced through the work of psychoanalysis in spite of the intervening decades. I believe that this is an important finding, the discovery of a caput nihil in neuropathology." End quote. A century later, this paper still rivals contemporary clinical descriptions of the effects of childhood sexual abuse. It is a brilliant, compassionate, eloquently argued, closely reasoned document. Its triumphant title and exultant tone suggest that Freud viewed his contribution as the crowning achievement in the field. Instead, the publication of The Etiology of Hysteria marked the end of this line of inquiry. Within a year, Freud had privately repudiated the traumatic theory of the origins of hysteria. His correspondence makes clear that he was increasingly troubled by the radical social implications of his hypothesis. Hysteria was so common among women that if his patients' stories were true, and if his theory was correct, he would be forced to conclude that what he called the perverted acts against children were endemic not only among the proletariat of Paris, where he had first studied hysteria, but also among the respectable bourgeois families of Vienna, where he had established his practice. The idea was simply unacceptable. It was beyond credibility. Faced with this dilemma, Freud stopped listening to his female patients. The turning point is documented in the famous case of Dora. This, the last of Freud's case studies on hysteria, reads more like a battle of wits than a cooperative venture. The interaction between Freud and Dora has been described as emotional combat. In this case, Freud still acknowledged the reality of his patient's experience. The adolescent Dora was being used as a pawn in her father's elaborate sex intrigues. Her father had essentially offered her to his friends as a sexual toy. Freud refused, however, to validate Dora's feelings of outrage and humiliation. Instead, he insisted upon exploring her feelings of erotic excitement, as if the exploitative situation were a fulfillment of her desire. In an act that Freud viewed as revenge, Dora broke off the treatment. The breach of their alliance marked the bitter end of an era of collaboration between ambitious investigators and hysterical patients. For close to a century, these patients would again be scorned and silenced. Freud's followers held a particular grudge against the rebellious Dora, who was later described by a disciple as one of the most repulsive hysterics he had ever met. Out of the ruins of the traumatic theory of hysteria, Freud created psychoanalysis. The dominant psychological theory of the next century was founded in the denial of women's reality. Sexuality remained the central focus of inquiry, but the exploitative social context in which sexual relations actually occur became utterly invisible. Psychoanalysis became a study of the internal vicissitudes of fantasy and desire, dissociated from the reality of experience. By the first decade of the 20th century, without ever offering any clinical documentation of false complaints, Freud had concluded that his hysterical patients' accounts of childhood sexual abuse were untrue. Quote, I was at last obliged to recognize that these scenes of seduction had never taken place, and that they were only fantasies which my patients had made up. End quote. Freud's recantation signified the end of the heroic age of hysteria. After the turn of the century, the entire line of inquiry initiated by Charcot and continued by his followers fell into neglect. Hypnosis and altered states of consciousness were once more relegated to the realm of the occult. The study of psychological trauma came to a halt. After a time, the disease of hysteria itself was said to have virtually disappeared. This dramatic reversal was not simply the work of one man. In order to understand how the study of hysteria could collapse so completely and how great discoveries could be so quickly forgotten, it is necessary to understand something of the intellectual and political climate that gave rise to the investigation in the first place. The central political conflict in 19th century France was the struggle between the proponents of a monarchy with an established religion and the proponents of a republican, secular form of government. 7 times since the Revolution of 1789, this conflict had led to the overthrow of the government. With the establishment of the Third Republic in 1870, the founding fathers of a new and fragile democracy mobilized an aggressive campaign to consolidate their power base and to undermine the power of their main opposition, the Catholic Church. The Republican leaders of this era were self-made men of the rising bourgeoisie. They saw themselves as representatives of a tradition of enlightenment, engaged in mortal struggle with the forces of reaction, the aristocracy and the clergy. Their major political battles were fought for the control of education. Their ideological battles were fought for the allegiance of men and the dominion of women. As Jules Ferry, a founding father of the Third Republic, put it, women must belong to science, or they will belong to the church. Charcot, the son of a tradesman who had risen to wealth and fame, was a prominent member of this new bourgeois elite. His salon was a meeting place for government ministers and other notables of the Third Republic. He shared with his colleagues in government a zeal for dissemination of secular scientific ideas. His modernization of the Salpêtre in the 1870s was carried out to demonstrate the superior virtues of secular teaching and hospital administration, and his investigations of hysteria were carried out to demonstrate the superiority of a secular over a religious conceptual framework. His Tuesday lectures were political theater. His mission was to claim hysterical women for science. Charcot's formulations of hysteria offered a scientific explanation for phenomena such as demonic possession states, witchcraft, exorcism, and religious ecstasy. One of his most cherished projects was the retrospective diagnosis of hysteria, as portrayed throughout the ages in works of art. With a disciple, Paul Richer, he published a collection of medieval artworks illustrating his thesis that religious experience depicted in art could be explained as a manifestations of hysteria. Charcot and his followers also entered into acrimonious debates on contemporary mystical phenomena, including cases of stigmatics, apparitions, and faith healing. Charcot was particularly concerned with the miraculous cures reportedly occurring in the newly established shrine at Lourdes. Genet was preoccupied with the American phenomenon of Christian Science. Charcot's disciple, Désiré Bournonville, used the newly established diagnostic criteria in an attempt to prove that a celebrated stigmatic of the time, a devout young woman named Louise Lateau, was actually a hysteric. All of these phenomena were claimed for the domain of medical pathology. It was thus a larger political cause that stimulated such passionate interest in hysteria and gave impetus to the investigations of Charcot and his followers in the late 19th century. The solution of the mystery of hysteria was intended to demonstrate the triumph of secular enlightenment over reactionary superstition, as well as the moral superiority of a secular worldview. Men of science contrasted their benevolent patronage of hysterics with the worst excesses of the Inquisition. Charles Richet, a disciple of Charcot, observed in 1880, quote, "Among the patients locked away at the Salpêtre were many who would have been burned in former times, whose illness would have been taken for a crime." End quote. William James echoed these sentiments a decade later. Quote, "Among the many victims of medical ignorance clad in authority, the poor hysteric has hitherto fared the worst, and her gradual rehabilitation and rescue will count among the philanthropic conquests of our generation." End quote. While these men of science saw themselves as benevolent rescuers, uplifting women from their degraded condition, they never for a moment envisioned a condition of social equality between women and men. Women were to be the objects of study and humane care, not subjects in their own right. The same men who advocated an enlightened view of hysteria often strongly opposed the admission of women into higher education or the professions, and adamantly opposed female suffrage. In the early years of the Third Republic, the feminist movement was relatively weak. Until the late 1870s, feminist organizations did not even have the right to hold public meetings or publish their literature. At the First International Congress for the Rights of Women, held in Paris in 1878, advocates of the right to vote were not permitted to speak because they were considered too revolutionary. Advocates of women's rights, recognizing that their fortunes depended upon the survival of the fragile new democracy, tended to subordinate their interests in order to preserve consensus within the Republican coalition. But a generation later, the regime of the Founding Fathers had become securely established. Republican secular government had survived and prospered in France. By the end of the 19th century, the anti-clerical battle had essentially been won. In the meantime, it had become more problematic for enlightened men to pose as the champions of women, for women were now daring to speak for themselves. The militancy of feminist movements in the established democracies of England and the United States had begun to spread to the continent, and French feminists had become much more assertive on behalf of women's rights. Some were pointedly critical of the Founding Fathers and challenged the benevolent patronage of men of science. One feminist writer in 1888 derided Charcot for his, quote, vivisection of women under the pretext of studying a disease, end quote, as well as for his hostility toward women entering the medical profession. By the turn of the century, the political impulse that had given birth to the heroic age of hysteria had dissipated. There was no longer any compelling reason to continue a line of investigation that had led men of science so far from where they originally intended to go. The study of hysteria had lured them into a netherworld of trance, emotionality, and sex. It had required them to listen to women far more than they had ever expected to listen, and to find out much more about women's lives than they had ever wanted to know. Certainly, they had never intended to investigate sexual trauma in the lives of women. As long as the study of hysteria was part of an ideological crusade, discoveries in the field were widely applauded, and scientific investigators were esteemed for their humanity and courage. But once this political impetus had faded, these same investigators found themselves compromised by the nature of their discoveries and by their close involvement with their women patients. The backlash that began even before Charcot's death in 1893. Increasingly, he found himself called upon to defend the credibility of the public demonstrations of hysteria that had enthralled Parisian society. It was widely rumored that the performances were staged by suggestible women who, knowingly or not, followed a script dictated under hypnosis by their patron. At the end of his life, he apparently regretted opening up this area of investigation. As Charcot retreated from the world of hypnosis and hysteria, Breuer retreated from the world of women's emotional attachments. The first talking cure ended with Breuer's precipitate flight from Anna O. He may have broken off the relationship because his wife resented his intense involvement with the fascinating young woman. Abruptly, he discontinued a course of treatment which had involved prolonged, almost daily meetings with his patient over a period of 2 years. The sudden termination provoked a crisis not only for the patient, who had to be hospitalized, but apparently also for the doctor, who was appalled at the realization that his patient had become passionately attached to him. He left his final session with Anna O. in a cold sweat. Though Breuer later collaborated with Freud in publishing this extraordinary case, he was a reluctant and doubting explorer. In particular, Breuer was troubled by the repeated findings of sexual experiences as the source of hysterical symptoms. As Freud complained to his confidant, William Fleiss, quote, "Not long ago, Breuer made a big speech to the Physicians' Society about me, putting himself forward as a convert to belief in sexual etiology. When I thanked him privately for this, he spoiled my pleasure by saying, 'But all the same, I don't believe it.'" End quote. Freud's investigations led the furthest of all into the unrecognized reality of women's lives. His discovery of childhood sexual exploitation at the roots of hysteria crossed the outer limits of social credibility and brought him to a position of total ostracism within his profession. The publication of the Etiology of Hysteria, which he had expected to bring him glory, was met with a stony and universal silence among his elders and peers. As he wrote to Fleiss shortly afterward, quote, "I am as isolated as you could wish me to be. The word has been given out to abandon me, and a void is forming around me." End quote. Freud's subsequent retreat from the study of psychological trauma has come to be viewed as a matter of scandal. His recantation has been vilified as an act of personal cowardice. Yet to engage in this kind of ad hominem attack seems like a curious relic of Freud's own era, in which advances in knowledge were understood as Promethean acts of solitary male genius. No matter how cogent his arguments or how valid his observations, Freud's discovery could not gain acceptance in the absence of a political and social context that would support the investigation of hysteria, wherever it might lead. Such a context had never existed in Vienna and was fast disappearing in France. Freud's rival, Genet, who never abandoned his traumatic theory of hysteria, and who never retreated from his hysterical patients, lived to see his works forgotten and his ideas neglected. Over time, Freud's repudiation of the traumatic theory of hysteria did take on a peculiarly dogmatic quality. The man who had pursued the investigation the furthest and grasped its implications the most completely retreated in later life into the most rigid denial. In the process, he disavowed his female patients. Though he continued to focus on his patients' sexual lives, he no longer acknowledged the exploitative nature of women's real experiences. With a stubborn persistence that drove him into ever greater convolutions of theory, he insisted that women imagined and longed for the abusive sexual encounters of which they complained. Perhaps the sweeping character of Freud's recantation is understandable, given the extremity of the challenge he faced. To hold fast to his theory would have been to recognize the depths of sexual oppression of women and children. The only potential source of intellectual validation and support for this position was the nascent feminist movement, which threatened Freud's cherished patriarchal values. To ally himself with such a movement was unthinkable for a man of Freud's political beliefs and professional ambitions. Protesting too much, he dissociated himself at once from the study of psychological trauma and from women. He went on to develop a theory of human development in which the inferiority and mendacity of women are fundamental points of doctrine. In an anti-feminist political climate, this theory prospered and thrived. The only one of the early investigators who carried on the exploration of hysteria to its logical conclusion was Breuer's patient Anna O. After Breuer abandoned her, she apparently remained ill for several years, and then she recovered. The mute hysteric who had invented the talking cure found her voice and her sanity in the women's liberation movement. Under a pseudonym, Paul Berthold, she translated into German the classic treatise by Mary Wollstonecraft, A Vindication of the Rights of Women, and authored a play, Women's Rights. Under her own name, Bertha Pappenheim became a prominent feminist social worker, intellectual, and organizer. In the course of a long and fruitful career, she directed an orphanage for girls, founded a feminist organization for Jewish women, and traveled throughout Europe and the Middle East to campaign against the sexual exploitation of women and children. Her dedication, energy, and commitment were legendary. In the words of a colleague, quote, "A volcano lived in this woman. Her fight against the abuse of women and children was almost a physically felt pain for her." End quote. At her death, the philosopher Martin Buber commemorated her. Quote, "I not only admired her, but loved her, and will love her until the day I die. There are people of spirit, and there are people of passion, both less common than one might think. Rarer still are the people of spirit and passion, but rarest of all is a passionate spirit. Bertha Pappenheim was a woman with just such a spirit. Pass on her memory, be witness that it still exists." End quote. In her will, she expressed the wish that those who visited her grave would leave a small stone. As a quiet promise, to serve the mission of women's duties and women's joy, unflinchingly and courageously. The traumatic neuroses of war. The reality of psychological trauma was forced upon public consciousness once again by the catastrophe of the First World War. In this prolonged war of attrition, over 8 million men died in 4 years. When the slaughter was over, 4 European empires had been destroyed, and many of the cherished beliefs that had sustained Western civilization had been shattered. One of the many casualties of the war's devastation was the illusion of manly honor and glory in battle. Under conditions of unremitting exposure to the horrors of trench warfare, men began to break down in shocking numbers. Confined and rendered helpless, subjected to constant threat of annihilation, and forced to witness the mutilation and death of their comrades without any hope of reprieve, many soldiers began to act like hysterical women. They screamed and wept uncontrollably. They froze and could not move. They became mute and unresponsive. They lost their memory and their capacity to feel. The number of psychiatric casualties was so great that hospitals had to be hastily requisitioned to house them. According to one estimate, mental breakdowns represented 40% of British battle casualties. Military authorities attempted to suppress reports of psychiatric casualties because of their demoralizing effect on the public. Initially, the symptoms of mental breakdowns were attributed to a physical cause. The British psychologist Charles Myers, who examined some of the first cases, attributed their symptoms to the concussive effects of exploding shells, and called the resulting nervous disorder shell shock. The name stuck, even though it soon became clear that the syndrome could be found in soldiers who had not been exposed to any physical trauma. Gradually, military psychiatrists were forced to acknowledge that the symptoms of shell shock were due to psychological trauma. The emotional stress of prolonged exposure to violent death was sufficient to produce a neurotic syndrome resembling hysteria in men. When the existence of a combat neurosis could no longer be denied, medical controversy, as in the earlier debate on hysteria, centered upon the moral character of the patient. In the view of traditionalists, a normal soldier should glory in war and betray no sign of emotion. Certainly, he should not succumb to terror. The soldier who developed a traumatic neurosis was at best a constitutionally inferior human being, at worst a malingerer and a coward. Medical writers of the period described these patients as moral invalids. Some military authorities maintained that these men did not deserve to be patients at all, that they should be court-martialed or dishonorably discharged, rather than given medical treatment. The most prominent proponent of the traditionalist view was the British psychiatrist U.S. Yelland. In his 1918 treatise, Hysterical Disorders of Warfare, he advocated a treatment strategy based on shaming, threats, and punishment. Hysterical symptoms such as mutism, sensory loss, or motor paralysis were treated with electrical shocks. Patients were excoriated for their laziness and cowardice. Those who exhibited the hideous enemy of negativism were threatened with court-martial. In one case, Yelland reported treating a mute patient by strapping him into a chair and applying electric shocks to his throat. The treatment went on without respite for hours, until the patient finally spoke. As the shocks were applied, Yelland exhorted the patient to, quote, "Remember, you must behave as the hero I expect you to be. A man who has gone through so many battles should have better control of himself." End quote. Progressive medical authorities argued, on the contrary, that combat neurosis was a bona fide psychiatric condition that could occur in soldiers of high moral character. They advocated humane treatment based upon psychoanalytic principles. The champion of this more liberal point of view was W.H.R. Rivers, a physician of wide-ranging intellect who was a professor of neurophysiology, psychology, and anthropology. His most famous patient was a young officer, Siegfried Sassoon, who had distinguished himself for conspicuous bravery in combat and for his war poetry. Sassoon gained notoriety when, while still in uniform, he publicly affiliated himself with the pacifist movement and denounced the war. The text of his Soldier's Declaration, written in 1917, reads like a contemporary anti-war manifesto. Quote, I am making this statement as an act of willful defiance of military authority, because I believe that the war is being deliberately prolonged by those who have the power to end it. I am a soldier, convinced that I am acting on behalf of soldiers. I believe that this war, upon which I entered as a war of defense and liberation, has now become a war of aggression and conquest. I have seen and endured the sufferings of the troops, and I can no longer be a party to prolong these sufferings for ends which I believe to be evil and unjust. End quote. Fearing that Sassoon would be court-martialed, one of his fellow officers, the poet Robert Graves, arranged for him to be hospitalized under Rivers' care. His anti-war statement could then be attributed to a psychological collapse. Though Sassoon had not had a complete emotional breakdown, he did have what Graves described as a bad state of nerves. He was restless, irritable, and tormented by nightmares. His impulsive risk-taking and reckless exposure to danger had earned him the nickname Mad Jack. Today, these symptoms would undoubtedly have qualified him for a diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder. Rivers' treatment of Sassoon was intended to demonstrate the superiority of humane, enlightened treatment over the more punitive traditionalist approach. The goal of treatment, as in all military medicine, was to return the patient to combat. Rivers did not question this goal. He did, however, argue for the efficacy of a form of talking cure. Rather than being shamed, Sassoon was treated with dignity and respect. Rather than being silenced, he was encouraged to write and talk freely about the terrors of war. Sassoon responded with gratitude. Quote, he made me feel safe at once and seemed to know all about me. I would give a lot for a few gramophone records of my talks with Rivers. All that matters is my remembrance of the great and good man who gave me his friendship and guidance. End quote. Rivers' psychotherapy of his famous patient was judged a success. Sassoon publicly disavowed his pacifist statement and returned to combat. He did so even though his political convictions were unchanged. What induced him to return was the loyalty he felt to his comrades who were still fighting, his guilt at being spared their suffering, and his despair at the ineffectiveness of his isolated protest. Rivers, by pursuing a course of humane treatment, had established two principles that would be embraced by American military psychiatrists in the next war. He had demonstrated, first, that men of unquestioned bravery could succumb to overwhelming fear, and second, that the most effective motivation to overcome that fear was something stronger than patriotism, abstract principles, or hatred of the enemy. It was the love of soldiers for one another. Sassoon survived the war, but like many survivors with combat neurosis, he was condemned to relive it for the rest of his life. He devoted himself to writing and rewriting his war memoirs, to preserving the memory of the fallen, and to furthering the cause of pacifism. Though he recovered from his bad case of nerves sufficiently to have a productive life, he was haunted by the memory of those who had not been so fortunate. Quote, shell shock. How many a brief bombardment had its long-delayed after-effect in the minds of these survivors, many of whom had looked at their companions and laughed while Inferno did its best to destroy them. Not then was their evil hour, but now in the sweating suffocation of nightmare, in paralysis of limbs, in the stammering of dislocated speech. Worst of all, in the disintegration of those qualities through which they had been so gallant and selfless and uncomplaining. This, in the finer types of men, was the unspeakable tragedy of shell shock. In the name of civilization, these soldiers had been martyred, and it remained for civilization to prove that their martyrdom wasn't a dirty swindle. End quote. Within a few years after the end of the war, medical interest in the subject of psychological trauma faded once again. Though numerous men with long-lasting psychiatric disabilities crowded the back wards of veterans' hospitals, their presence had become an embarrassment to civilized societies, eager to forget. In 1922, a young American psychiatrist, Abram Kardiner, returned to New York from a year-long pilgrimage to Vienna, where he had been analyzed by Freud. He was inspired by the dream of making a great discovery. What could be more adventurous, he thought, than to be a Columbus in the relatively new science of the mind? Kardiner set up a private practice of psychoanalysis at a time when there were perhaps 10 psychoanalysts in New York. He also went to work in the psychiatric clinic of the Veterans Bureau, where he saw numerous men with combat neurosis. He was troubled by the severity of their distress and by his inability to cure them. In particular, he remembered one patient whom he treated for a year without notable success. Later, when the patient thanked him, Kardiner protested, "But I never did anything for you. I certainly didn't cure your symptoms." "But, Doc," the patient replied, "you did try. I've been around the Veterans Administration for a long time, and I know they don't even try, and they don't really care. But you did." Kardiner subsequently acknowledged that the ceaseless nightmare of his own early childhood, poverty, hunger, neglect, domestic violence, and his mother's untimely death, had influenced the direction of his intellectual pursuits and allowed him to identify with the traumatized soldiers. Kardiner struggled for a long time to develop a theory of war trauma within the intellectual framework of psychoanalysis, but he eventually abandoned the task as impossible and went on to a distinguished career, first in psychoanalysis and then, like his predecessor Rivers, in anthropology. In 1939, in collaboration with the anthropologist Cote Dubois, he authored a basic anthropology text, The Individual and His Society. It was only then, after writing this book, that he was able to return to the subject of war trauma, this time having in anthropology a conceptual framework that recognized the impact of social reality and enabled him to understand psychological trauma. In 1941, Kardiner published a comprehensive clinical and theoretical study, The Traumatic Neuroses of War, in which he complained of the episodic amnesia that had repeatedly disrupted the field. Quote, "The subject of neurotic disturbances consequent upon war has, in the past 25 years, been submitted to a good deal of capriciousness in public interest and psychiatric whims. The public does not sustain its interest, which was very great after World War I, and neither does psychiatry. Hence these conditions are not subject to continuous study, but only to periodic efforts which cannot be characterized as very diligent. In part, this is due to the declining status of the veterans after a war. Though not true in psychiatry generally, it is a deplorable fact that each investigator who undertakes to study these conditions considers it his sacred obligation to start from scratch and work at the problem as if no one had ever done anything with it before." End quote. Kardiner went on to develop the clinical outlines of the traumatic syndrome as it is understood today. His theoretical formulations strongly resembled Genet's late 19th century formulations of hysteria. Indeed, Kardiner recognized that war neuroses represented a form of hysteria, but he also realized that the term had once again become so pejorative that its very use discredited patients. Quote, "When the word hysterical is used, its social meaning is that the subject is a predatory individual, trying to get something for nothing. The victim of such a neurosis is, therefore, without sympathy in court, and without sympathy from his physicians, who often take hysterical to mean that the individual is suffering from some persistent form of wickedness, perversity, or weakness of will." End quote. With the advent of the Second World War came a revival of medical interest in combat neurosis. In the hopes of finding a rapid, efficacious treatment, military psychiatrists tried to remove the stigma from the stress reactions of combat. It was recognized for the first time that any man could break down under fire, and that psychiatric casualties could be predicted in direct proportion to the severity of combat exposure. Indeed, considerable effort was devoted to determining the exact level of exposure guaranteed to produce a psychological collapse. A year after the war ended, two American psychiatrists, J. W. Apple and G. W. Beebe, concluded that 200 to 240 days in combat would suffice to break even the strongest soldier. Quote, "There is no such thing as getting used to combat. Each moment of combat imposes a strain so great that men will break down in direct relation to the intensity and duration of their exposure. Thus, psychiatric casualties are as inevitable as gunshot and shrapnel wounds in warfare." End quote. American psychiatrists focused their energy on identifying those factors that might protect against acute breakdown or lead to rapid recovery. They discovered once again what Rivers had demonstrated in his treatment of Sassoon, the power of emotional attachments among fighting men. In 1947, Gardiner revised his classic text in collaboration with Herbert Spiegel, a psychiatrist who had just returned from treating men at the front. Gardiner and Spiegel used hypnosis to induce an altered state, while Grinker and Spiegel used sodium amytal, a technique they called narcosynthesis. As in the earlier works on hysteria, the focus of the talking cure for combat neurosis was on the recovery and cathartic relieving of traumatic memories, with all their attendant emotions of terror, rage, and grief. The psychiatrists who pioneered these techniques understood that unburdening traumatic memories was not in itself sufficient to effect a lasting cure. Gardiner and Spiegel warned that although hypnosis could expedite the retrieval of traumatic memories, a simple cathartic experience by itself was useless. Hypnosis failed, they explained, where there is not sufficient follow-through. Grinker and Spiegel observed likewise that treatment would not succeed if the memories retrieved and discharged under the influence of sodium amytal were not integrated into consciousness. The effect of combat, they argued, quote, "is not like the writing on a slate that can be erased, leaving the slate as it was before. Combat leaves a lasting impression on men's minds, changing them as radically as any crucial experience through which they live." End quote. These wise warnings, however, were generally ignored. The new rapid treatment for psychiatric casualties was considered highly successful at the time. According to one report, 80% of the American fighting men who succumbed to acute stress in the Second World War were returned to some kind of duty, usually within a week. 30% were returned to combat units. Little attention was paid to the fate of these men once they returned to active duty, let alone after they returned home from the war. As long as they could function on a minimal level, they were thought to have recovered. With the end of the war, the familiar process of amnesia set in once again. There was little medical or public interest in the psychological condition of returning soldiers. The lasting effects of war trauma were once again forgotten. Systematic, large-scale investigation of the long-term psychological effects of combat was not undertaken until after the Vietnam War. This time, the motivation for study came not from the military or the medical establishment, but from the organized efforts of soldiers disaffected from war. In 1970, while the Vietnam War was at its height, two psychiatrists, Robert J. Lifton and Chaim Schatten, met with representatives of a new organization called Vietnam Veterans Against the War. For veterans to organize against their own war while it was still ongoing was virtually unprecedented. The small group of soldiers, many of whom had distinguished themselves for bravery, returned their medals and offered public testimony of their war crimes. Their presence contributed moral credibility to a growing anti-war movement. They raised questions, Lifton wrote, about everyone's version of the socialized warrior and the war system, and exposed their country's counterfeit claim of a just war. The anti-war veterans organized what they called rap groups. In these intimate meetings of their peers, Vietnam veterans retold and relived their traumatic experiences of war. They invited sympathetic psychiatrists to offer them professional assistance. Schatten later explained why the men sought help outside of a traditional psychiatric setting. Quote, "A lot of them were hurting, as they put it, but they didn't want to go to the Veterans Administration for help. They needed something that would take place on their own turf, where they were in charge." End quote. The purpose of the rap groups was twofold: to give solace to individual veterans who had suffered psychological trauma, and to raise awareness about the effects of war. The testimony that came out of these groups focused public attention on the lasting psychological injuries of combat. These veterans refused to be forgotten. Moreover, they refused to be stigmatized. They insisted upon the rightness, the dignity of their distress. In the words of a Marine veteran, Michael Norman, quote, "Family and friends wondered why we were so angry. 'What are you crying about?' they would ask. 'Why are you so ill-tempered and disaffected?' Our fathers and grandfathers had gone off to war, done their duty, come home and got on with it. What made our generation so different? As it turns out, nothing, no difference at all. When old soldiers from good wars are dragged from behind the curtain of myth and sentiment and brought into the light, they too seem to smolder with choler and alienation. So we were angry. Our anger was old, atavistic. We were angry as all civilized men who have ever been sent to make murder in the name of virtue were angry." End quote. By the mid-1970s, hundreds of informal rap groups had been organized. By the end of the decade, the political pressure from veterans organizations resulted in a legal mandate for a psychological treatment program called Operation Outreach within the Veterans Administration. Over 100 outreach centers were organized, staffed by veterans, and based upon a self-help peer counseling model of care. The insistent organizing of veterans also provided the impetus for systematic psychiatric research. In the years following the war, the Veterans Administration commissioned comprehensive studies tracing the impact of wartime experiences on the lives of returning veterans. A 5-volume study on the legacies of Vietnam delineated the syndrome of post-traumatic stress disorder and demonstrated beyond any reasonable doubt its direct relationship to combat exposure. The moral legitimacy of the anti-war movement and the national experience of defeat in a discredited war had made it possible to recognize psychological trauma as a lasting and inevitable legacy of war. In 1980, for the first time, the characteristic syndrome of psychological trauma became a real diagnosis. In that year, the American Psychiatric Association included in its official Manual of Mental Disorders a new category called post-traumatic stress disorder. The clinical features of this disorder were congruent with the more traumatic neuroses that Gardner had outlined 40 years earlier. Thus, the syndrome of psychological trauma, periodically forgotten and periodically rediscovered through the past century, finally attained formal recognition within the diagnostic canon. The combat neurosis of the sex war. The late 19th century studies of hysteria foundered on the question of sexual trauma. At the time of these investigations, there was no awareness that violence is a routine part of women's sexual and domestic lives. Freud glimpsed this truth and retreated in horror. For most of the 20th century, it was the study of combat veterans that led to the development of a body of knowledge about traumatic disorders. Not until the women's liberation movement of the 1970s was it recognized that the most common post-traumatic disorders are not those not of men in war, but of women in civilian life. The real condition of women's lives were hidden in the sphere of the personal, the private life. The cherished value of privacy created a powerful barrier to consciousness and rendered women's reality practically invisible. To speak about experiences in sexual or domestic life was to invite public humiliation, ridicule, and disbelief. Women were silenced by fear and shame, and the silence of women gave license to every form of sexual and domestic exploitation. Women did not have a name for the tyranny of private life. It was difficult to recognize that a well-established democracy in the public sphere could coexist with conditions of primitive autocracy or advanced dictatorship in the home. Thus, it was no accident that in the first manifesto of the resurgent American feminist movement, Betty Friedan called the woman question the problem without a name. It was also no accident that the initial method of the movement was called consciousness raising. Consciousness raising took place in groups that shared many characteristics of the veterans' rap groups and of psychotherapy. They had the same intimacy, the same confidentiality, and the same imperative of truth-telling. The creation of a privileged space made it possible for women to overcome the barriers of denial, secrecy, and shame that prevented them from naming their injuries. In the protected environment of the consulting room, women had dared to speak of rape, but the learned men of science had not believed them. In the protected environment of consciousness-raising groups, women spoke of rape and other women believed them. A poem of this era captures the exhilaration that women felt in speaking aloud and being heard. Quote, "Today, in my small natural body, I sit and learn. My woman's body, like yours, target on any street, taken from me at the age of 12. I watch a woman dare. I dare to watch a woman. We dare to raise our voices." End quote. Though the methods of consciousness raising were analogous to those of psychotherapy, their purpose was to effect social rather than individual change. A feminist understanding of sexual assault empowered victims to breach the barriers of privacy, to support one another, and to take collective action. Consciousness raising was also an empirical method of inquiry. Kathy Sarachild, one of the originators of consciousness raising, described it as a challenge to the prevailing intellectual orthodoxy. Quote, "The decision to emphasize our own feelings and experiences as women, and to test all generalizations and reading we did by our own experience, was actually the scientific method of research. We were, in effect, repeating the 17th century challenge of science to scholasticism. Study nature, not books, and put all theories to the test of living practice and action." End quote. The process that began with consciousness raising led by stages to increased levels of public awareness. The first public speak-out on rape was organized by the New York Radical Feminists in 1971. The first International Tribunal on Crimes Against Women was held in Brussels in 1976. Rape reform legislation was initiated in the United States by the National Organization for Women in the mid-1970s. Within a decade, reforms had been enacted in all 50 states in order to encourage the silenced victims of sexual crimes to come forward. Beginning in the mid-1970s, The American women's movement also generated an explosion of research on the previously ignored subject of sexual assault. In 1975, in response to feminist pressure, a Center for Research on Rape was created within the National Institute of Mental Health. For the first time, the doors were opened to women as the agents rather than the objects of inquiry. In contrast to the usual research norms, most of the principal investigators funded by the center were women. Feminist investigators labored close to their subjects. They repudiated emotional detachment as a measure of the value of scientific investigation, and frankly honored their emotional connection with their informants. As in the heroic age of hysteria, long and intimate personal interviews became once again a source of knowledge. The results of these investigations confirmed the reality of women's experiences that Freud had dismissed as fantasies a century before. Sexual assaults against women and children were shown to be pervasive and endemic in our culture. The most sophisticated epidemiological research was conducted in the early 1980s by Diana Russell, a sociologist and human rights activist. Over 900 women, chosen by random sampling techniques, were interviewed in depth about their experiences of domestic violence and sexual exploitation. The results were horrifying. 1 woman in 4 had been raped. 1 woman in 3 had been sexually abused in childhood. In addition to documenting pervasive sexual violence, the feminist movement offered a new language for understanding the impact of sexual assault. Entering the public discussion of rape for the first time, women found it necessary to establish the obvious, that rape is an atrocity. Feminists redefined rape as a crime of violence rather than a sexual act. The simplistic formulation was advanced to counter the view that rape fulfilled women's deepest desires, a view then prevailing in every form of literature, from popular pornography to academic texts. Feminists also redefined rape as a method of political control, enforcing the subordination of women through terror. The author Susan Brown Miller, whose landmark treatise on rape established the subject as a matter for public debate, called attention to rape as a means of maintaining male power. Quote, "Man's discovery that his genitalia could serve as a weapon to generate fear must rank as one of the most important discoveries of prehistoric times, along with the use of fire and the first crude stone axe. From prehistoric times to the present, I believe, rape has played a critical function. It is nothing more or less than a conscious process of intimidation by which all men keep all women in a state of fear." End quote. The women's movement not only raised public awareness of rape, but also initiated a new social response to victims. The first Rape Crisis Center opened its doors in 1971. A decade later, hundreds of such centers had sprung up throughout the United States. Organized outside the framework of medicine or the mental health system, these grassroots agencies offered practical, legal, and emotional support to rape victims. Rape Crisis Center volunteers often accompanied victims to the hospital, to the police station, and to the courthouse, in order to advocate for the dignified and respectful care that was so conspicuously lacking. Though their efforts were often met with hostility and resistance, they were also at times a source of inspiration for professional women working within those institutions. In 1972, Anne Burgess, a psychiatric nurse, and Linda Holstrom, a sociologist, embarked on a study of the psychological effects of rape. They arranged to be on call day or night in order to interview and counsel any rape victim who came to the emergency room of Boston City Hospital. In a year, they saw 92 women and 37 children. They observed a pattern of psychological reactions, which they called rape trauma syndrome. They noted that women experienced rape as a life-threatening event, having generally feared mutilation and death during the assault. They remarked that, in the aftermath of rape, Victims complained of insomnia, nausea, startle responses, and nightmares, as well as dissociative or numbing symptoms. And they commented that in some of the victims' symptoms resembled those previously described in combat veterans. Rape was the feminist movement's initial paradigm for violence against women in the sphere of personal life. As understanding deepened, the investigation of sexual exploitation progressed to encompass relationships of increasing complexity, in which violence and intimacy commingled. The initial focus on street rape, committed by strangers, led step by step to the exploration of acquaintance rape, date rape, and rape in marriage. The initial focus on rape as a form of violence against women led to the exploration of domestic battery and other forms of private coercion. And the initial focus on the rape of adults led inevitably to a rediscovery of the sexual abuse of children. As in the case of rape, the initial work on domestic violence and the sexual abuse of children grew out of the feminist movement. Services for victims were organized outside of the traditional mental health system, often with the assistance of professional women inspired by the movement. The pioneering research on the psychological effects of victimization was carried out by women who saw themselves as active and committed participants in the movement. As in the case of rape, the psychological investigations of domestic violence and child sexual abuse led to a rediscovery of the syndrome of psychological trauma. The psychologist Lenore Walker, describing women who had fled to a shelter, initially defined what she called the battered woman syndrome. My own initial descriptions of the psychology of incest survivors essentially recapitulated the late 19th century observations of hysteria. Only after 1980, when the efforts of combat veterans had legitimated the concept of post-traumatic stress disorder, did it become clear that the psychological syndrome seen in survivors of rape, domestic battery, and incest was essentially the same as the syndrome seen in survivors of war. The implications of this insight are as horrifying in the present as they were a century ago. The subordinate condition of women is maintained and enforced by the hidden violence of men. There is a war between the sexes. Rape victims, battered women, and sexually abused children are its casualties. Hysteria is the combat neurosis of the sex war. 50 years ago, Virginia Woolf wrote that, quote, "The public and private worlds are inseparably connected. The tyrannies and servilities of one are the tyrannies and servilities of the other." End quote. It is now apparent, also, that the traumas of one are the traumas of the other. The hysteria of women and the combat neurosis of men are one. Recognizing the commonality of affliction may even make it possible at times to transcend the immense gulf that separates the public sphere of war and politics, the world of men, and the private sphere of domestic life, the world of women. Will these insights be lost once again? At the moment, the study of psychological trauma seems to be firmly established as a legitimate field of inquiry. With the creative energy that accompanies the return of repressed ideas, the field has expanded dramatically. 20 years ago, the literature consisted of a few out-of-print volumes moldering in neglected corners of the library. Now each month brings forth the publication of new books, new research findings, new discussions in the public media. But history teaches us that this knowledge could also disappear. Without the context of a political movement, it has never been possible to advance the study of psychological trauma. The fate of this field of knowledge depends upon the fate of the same political movement that has inspired and sustained it over the last century. In the late 19th century, the goal of that movement was the establishment of secular democracy. In the early 20th century, its goal was the abolition of war. In the late 20th century, its goal was the liberation of women. All of these goals remain. All are, in the end, inseparably connected. That ends chapter 1. I will not read any more. There's a good version of this on Audible, and I recommend that. And I hope this was informative for you. And as I like to say, thank you for listening.